one thing that's very evident, we're seeing more and more in the news now, is cybersecurity. Super important for any company looking to start up or products or anything in that fortune before. We've heard how hackers recently turned off a gas line in the States, ransomware. We've all heard about apparently, I don't know whether or not it is the real Anonymous, but basically having a little pop at Elon Musk for making Bitcoin go up and down and Dogecoin go up, etc. But it's super important these days to have cybersecurity as part of your overall picture when you're building a business. So I thought nothing better than to get a cybersecurity expert, Glen, in to come and talk to us about some of the areas that you should be considering and looking at, and also to give us some trends how hackers essentially are thinking. I remember years and years ago, 2 decades ago, a friend of mine, he used to be what was classed as, I guess you'd call him as an ethical hacker now, but he was doing his computer science degree back in the UK, and he funded himself by writing viruses and sending them to Symantec. And so it helped them basically think how they go. The irony was that my other flatmate ended up working for Symantec in America as one of their lead product developers. So, but anyway, I'd like to welcome Glen to this stage.
Woo!
Nothing more dodgy than the guy wearing a black hoodie, is it? I mean, that's right. When you put the picture up there.
Except on a morning as cold as this, I think.
It's probably not half in outside of hackers.
Oh, sorry, I've got to flip the slides over.
Yeah, the Elon Musk Twitter thing, I noticed recently that someone got into the Slack support channel of Twitter and accessed the support, actually managed to social engineer a credential for their support portal. So they were actually in a position where they could reset passwords for any Twitter account. So you can imagine the potential for that. Like if you just went onto Elon Musk's account and said buy this particular thing or whatever, it would go off. They were really stupid. They were probably just a teenager or whatever, and they just did some stupid hit, pay some Bitcoin money to me kind of thing, and they got caught really quickly. But that was an interesting one. I thought a lot of potential there if you're a criminal, but they kind of wasted it, to be honest. So thanks, Dave. I'm a penetration tester. I'm a professional hacker. Been doing that for about 8 years now. I work in offensive security, which basically means I try to break into things, and I tell the client what's the problem. So how do you stop yourself getting hacked is the short version of what I do. So what I'm going to do today is talk about a couple of things that I've encountered throughout my technical experience. It's sort of focused more on the low-hanging fruit end of things.
Just hit the arrow if the clicker's not working.
I haven't clicked it yet, so
okay.
Let's try this amazing. There we go. This slide here is really just an example of, it's a game. I put it in here just as a quick example. Does anyone play Counter-Strike or anything? Does anyone encounter first-person shooters? Does anyone see a problem with this picture at all? Does this look like a normal game to you? Okay, so it's not. The short version is that it's a cheater. You should never see these boxes. It's showing where everybody is. It's probably got some other hacks going on, aimbots and things. And the point of this slide is not to say, oh, I'm playing games, or I do like the game occasionally, but to show you that you just can't really trust the client. You can't trust what's going on. Now, games and web apps and mobile apps and other client-based things have similar issues in that. They have to a certain extent, trust what the client's doing, but we try and minimize that as much as possible. For historical reasons, primarily around performance, you can't really do that so much with games. And so they have to trust a lot more about what's going on. There's some more advanced anti-cheat type stuff which happens these days, but by and large, for example, if you're a player running around a virtual world and you tell the server, oh, I've just moved over here, the server kind of has to trust you, so they can do magical things like teleport and this kind of thing. But the main point about this is you can't really trust the client, and that's going to be a theme as I go through this talk and show you some of the technical examples.
So what you're saying there is that essentially there are some people who play this game who have got this overlay so they know exactly where everybody is.
Absolutely. So if you watch something like this running, it's shocking. So if you play a game, you expect you can't see someone behind a wall, for example. You can. And this is showing where everybody in the map is. They also have things which automatically make sure that your gun is always pointing at the head of the opposing players. Speed hacks are a common one, which is basically moving like the flash around the level and things like that. And it just comes down to trusting user input. For example, the game will trust that your mouse is being controlled by a human hand, not a piece of software. Things like that. It's kind of a bit of a broad application to all software. Games are a particularly good example of this. But I do like it. And watching some of these on YouTube is pretty shocking if you're into that sort of thing. So go down to the next slide. So I'm going to tell you some war stories about hacks that I've done and tie them back to potentially your tech stack. So it's a pretty common theme with startups. Not every startup is obviously going to be doing this, but you're going to be running some sort of tech stack, whether that's application, mobile app, web app, stuff like that. If anybody is familiar with Linux, you probably see straight away what's going on here. This is back 1996. I was in high school, so you can probably reverse engineer my age approximately from that. I had a website set up internal to the school. I think the maths teacher was roped into being the IT guy. That's how old it was. I don't know what they had on there. Some links to probably Yahoo and stuff like that, which was useful to the school. I knew a little bit about Linux at the time, which is the operating system running behind this. It's really common these days. Obviously, a lot of AWS stuff runs on it. You're going to see a lot of Linux around the place. And I just read some stuff in a book and thought, I'll just try this. So I kind of tried, move my mouse, awesome. Just change this path here to that. And all of a sudden looking at this file here. Now, if you know what this is a credentials file for the system. So if you know what you're doing with this, you can access the system directly as the local administrator. So this is an example. Why am I showing this? This is a 20-plus-year-old issue that I discovered. This is not actually the file, obviously. I don't have it from all those years ago. But this is a very simple hack. It doesn't require a lot of knowledge. It doesn't need a significant amount of special knowledge, a little bit. You'd probably say that red stuff there is a bit of special knowledge, but nothing you couldn't read out of a book or just Google. Although Google wasn't around those days, this is actually pretty good. But the impact is massive. So this gives someone access to that server, and that's kind of the theme of what I'm going to show you today. Stuff which is really low-hanging fruit, that it's easy for someone to execute, but can have quite a significant impact to your startup tech stack. So that's kind of the example there. I didn't use this in any kind of malicious way, I should say. I was just curious. I didn't really know what to do with this file at the time, but there it was anyway. So that's an example of an IDOR. We call that an IDOR, which is insecure direct object reference. We didn't have that term in those days. And as I've said, it's really easy, high impact. So that's what we got. So the talk is about this. So how can you get some really low-hanging fruit and take it out of your threat model? So what is it that's going to cause you strife, and what are those things you can really easily fix? So you might not be a technical person, you might be managing technical people, but hopefully some of the information that I give today you'll be able to pass on and they'll understand what we're talking about in general terms. So I got my awesome slides here. Any cyber people in the room at all in any capacity? So we have two, very good, great. So if you have any experience in any kind of cyber blue team, GRC, maybe pen testing, or they'll probably recognise you if you're in the room. There's not that many of us around town. You recognise this quickly. It's a cyber risk threat matrix. So we pretty much work out how something is going to be rated in terms of severity. This is a pretty dry slide, but I'm going to quickly show you what it's about because it's going to illustrate some of the other bugs that I showed you. So we're interested in stuff which is up here. The red stuff in the corner, very likely and high impact. So impact is something that's really easy for a business to understand, I've found. So you can pretty much say, look, we can show all the customer data, or you can take the service down and create a business outage. The business is going to straight away understand what that's about. So you can quantify that quite easily. The likelihood is more of a nuanced metric. So particularly if you're getting into the place where you measure CVSS, I don't know if anyone's familiar with that term. It's a way that we measure the severity of bugs that are publicly available. But it will come down to things like how easy is it to do? Do you need special knowledge? Do you need special training? Do you need special tools? Do people know about this? How hard is it to do? So what I'm going to be showing you is stuff that's easy to do. Really, really easy to do and has a significantly high impact. So that's our stuff up here in the corner. So you can have, for example, on the far end of this scale, and one of the points I could make here is that if somebody wants to hack you, and they're dedicated and motivated enough to do so, and they have the correct skill set, they will hack you. they will get you. It doesn't really, you can't really protect against that. It's an unfortunate fact. Fortunately, I would assume most of us in the room, unless you're sort of some kind of cloak and dagger agency person in disguise, you're probably not going to be meeting the bar for that level of adversary. So somebody who's really dedicated, they've got teams of people working on stuff, they can do the research, spend the time, they can actually get access to all the things you have and ruin your business. But you're probably not going to have that. Unless you annoy the entire anonymous collective or something like that, you might be having to think about that a bit more. Most of us, not the case. So what I'm going to show you is 4 very broad, I'd say classes of bug. They're not really classes, I've mixed and matched here. We'll call them classes of bug. 2 things you can change in code and 2 things you can change in config if you have a tech stack that you want to secure better. So I picked on these because I've seen them quite a lot, and they're quite broad. So the top one, IDOR, you saw it. I can access a file without any kind of controls around it. Second one is going to be insufficient filtering. This is something we see that gives rise to a significant number of bugs and directly gives rise to data breaches. And then config stuff. These are really easy to fix, right? Debug errors, you can turn them off on the server, and something called content security policy, which is a web server header or a meta tag if you really want to implement it that way, which mitigates other kinds of bugs effectively. Okay, so the first case study I'm going to show you, what I'm going to tell you about, I can't actually show you screenshots of this stuff because it's all NDA type of thing, but working for a client, doing a vendor supply assessment, they have a startup. I call them a startup. I think they were bought by a larger company, and they did relocation stuff for executives. So they handle the entire service. So things like shipping for your everything from shipping for your household goods to another country to visa applications and all that sort of paperwork that you might need to do, and they do that as a service. The web application is pretty janky. We went in and tested it out. We noticed something straight away, a big problem with referred to as presentation layer security. Don't know if anyone's heard that term before, but effectively what it means is you're relying on the user interface to protect a lot of your data. So that's not going to stop anybody who's got a modicum of knowledge about how web applications work, how modern web apps work. They're just going to watch what it does. So we watched what it did, and everything that you uploaded to this, everything, and I'm talking about stuff like passport scans, so significant amounts of data about people who was like C-level executives in big companies big enough to headhunt internationally, would be stored in this system. And it's a SaaS solution too, so they had multiple clients. This is pretty much what it would call to access that file. Now, changing that number gave you a different document. Okay, that's weird. Is that the same user? No, it's not the same user. It's another user on a different account. There's quite a few in there, so there was at least 10,000 documents. So we quickly cycled through that and showed them some pretty scary stuff about people accessing customer data that wasn't. Yeah, go.
You say that, I would say everybody in this room has been subject to this. More up until, I won't mention it, but it was a major utility here in Perth who had exactly the same. If you went to their web address, it wasn't electricity for those, but if you went to their web address and you changed the URL, basically it would just give you another client's details and show you all their credit card details and everything. And they didn't report it. I said, you have to report this, and they didn't report it. They're like, no, we don't need to report this.
Yeah, this is really common. I'll show another example in a minute that I've personally encountered in the last few months. And I've seen at least 2 of these in the last 6 months that I've reported back to local organisations.
Trump's social network, the Parler one, which got into a lot of controversy. They did the exact same thing with their attachments. And people, like when the whole Capitol riots happened, people quickly noticed that, and before they got taken down by AWS, people actually went through and egress all their files and stuff, because everyone's uploading, them breaking into the Capitol building.
Videos and stuff, yeah.
All that stuff goes to the FBI to.
Yeah, I saw the timelines that they built from that. It was pretty cool. Yeah. Similar type issue. So this was actually really bad because it wasn't even authenticated. You could hit this without any kind of logging in process occurring at all. So it wasn't even checking for a valid session. This URL was good, from anyone accessing it on the internet at all. So we obviously, this was pretty severe. They thought they were getting a big contract from a big company. Turns out it wasn't as easy as that. I ended up on phone calls with their development team in Hong Kong and their London office. And they were pretty much trying to talk their way out of it. Fortunately, the business I worked for wasn't buying it for a minute. and they had some significant refactoring to do with that program before they were able to rebid for it. Let's go to the next one. Same thing, right? So I just went to book something in a medical centre. They sent me an SMS, and it had this link here, so I could fill in my details. I went to that link, it pre-filled some details in for me, which was nice. And the rest of it was things like past medical history, contact next of kin, why I'm visiting the centre today, Medicare number, the whole thing, basically the whole package you need for some serious identity theft, and probably some blackmail as well, depending on what you're attending the centre for. And I just hit that URL, and me being me, I typoed the number on the end, and I'm looking at somebody else's data. Oh my God. So I rang them, gave them a call, did the right thing, sent them an email from my work address so they know that I'm legit, and explained the problem. This is, oh, by this way, this is an Australian startup. They were actually servicing a bunch of medical centres. They're a SaaS solution hosted here. So
Hopefully it's not helping.
I don't know if they're hosting in Perth, but they're definitely hosting a number of places, and servicing a number of sort of GP places and other kinds of places like that. And to their credit, they got that fixed really quickly. I'm glad they did that, because sometimes it's hard to get traction on this type of thing, particularly when you're talking with a medical receptionist who has no idea about IT. But they did fix that. And that.
I can only think of about 3 that are hosted here in Australia, which is Clinico and Hotdog.
It actually wasn't the big ones, right? So it was a smaller outfit. It's probably why we're looking at this problem. It looked like a 1 or 2 person operation. I didn't contact them directly. I spoke with the customer, which probably was the better way to do it. I could also point out, I don't have a slide for this, but a similar example with one of the local universities. I accessed data just by typing in a number. It was once again a form pre-filled thing. It's like a user experience thing. They're trying to make it smoother, less friction for the user, but it fills stuff in. And that's bad, right? Because the user service, sending you more information than you gave it. And I could pull out dates of birth, last enrolled date, things like that, based on just a student number, which is a number. You can cycle through that as much as you want. They fixed that with some talk about, it was just temporary glitch in the system and all that sort of stuff, which I really didn't buy, but whatever, it's fixed. We're moving on. No data breach notification, for sure. All right, so this is I wasn't in cyber yet. But this is the payroll system of a software company I worked for. They were about 35 employees when I started working for them. Their turnover was around about $10 million a year. So they're doing okay. They had some nice clients. They had some resource companies and sort of client list. They did a lot of their internal software development. This would have been .NET back in about 2005, somewhere in there. I didn't know about much cyber, but I had read about this cool thing called SQL injection. Which is basically what you're looking at here, and I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but I will quickly give you a rundown of it in the next slide. So you log into the payroll system, you can access everything. They use this for invoicing, timesheets, and also for clients to be able to access and see where their current billing was at. So it was accessible to the internet and also accessible to internal users, and certain levels of people would be able to access certain levels of information. I could access my timesheets, that was about it, because I was just a systems admin. I tried this, right? Instead of the username and password, I just chucked in that, which is a X quotation or quotation 1, quotation equals quotation 1. That kind of looks like a bit of a janky string, right? You'll see why it's not in just a moment. And I threw that in there, and I ended up logged in as the CFO. Seriously, so I could access absolutely everything in this system. So from client billing to seeing what my colleagues were being paid, timesheets, things like that. And the reason for that was happy coincidence in that his surname ended with Z, and if I didn't put a username in, it defaulted to the last user in the table, and that was him. So if I didn't know a username, I could have logged in as anybody else. This is what happens, right? So in the back end, you've got a query which is basically evaluating whether a user exists. Does this user that I've provided credentials for, username and password, are they real? And it just returns true or false. There's usually some other kind of logic around it as well to establish a session and do authorization for this kind of for the user appropriately, but this is a really simple boiled down example. So if I stick, instead of an actual password in there, and it's an unfiltered query, so it's actually taking the string that I give it and it's trusting it as the user So it's trusting as the person playing that video game that I'm actually doing what I'm supposed to be doing. It's actually going to turn it into part of the SQL query. So you can see here why that's bad. It doesn't do a valid check anymore. It always returns as true. So what I'm doing, if anyone understands anything about SQL, you see straight away, where user equals the value I've sent it, and the password equals the value I've sent it, or 1 equals 1. That's always going to be true. So no worries, we'll return true for that and log you into the system. Thanks for coming. That's very basic. That is a prototypical example of SQL injection. And it's given rise to because there's insufficient filtering in your application. And it's a specific example, but it's illustrating the overall principle of filter everything. Do not trust the user, do not trust what's getting sent to your application. Now I'll give you a quick example of the code, so gird yourself. Now I'll whip this up really quickly, it's not the real code, it's probably half Python, half C, I'll do it really quickly. And this is a simple, sort of wrapped a bit funny there, but you get the idea. Basically it's saying, here's a bunch of OK characters. We only really want to accept alphabetical and numeric, and maybe I'll put a dash on the end there because my surname has actually got a hyphen in it. And why would we accept a username that has special characters in it? We might accept the password, there's other logic around dealing with that safely, but if anyone's seen how many characters are possible to generate, not just with the keyboard, you've got hundreds and hundreds of characters. In the ASCII table, the extended ASCII table, you've got Unicode versions of them, and they can all do some pretty janky stuff to a back-end system that's not expecting it. So if you've got some .NET code or PHP or whatever you're developing in, and you're just grabbing that stuff and sticking it in your application somewhere, you're going to end up with a bug. And one of these bugs, we just looked at SQL injection. There's another one really common cross-site scripting, which lets you execute things in the context of the browser's JavaScript DOM session. And then command injection, which is really bad. Hopefully no one ever uses anything that utilizes the command injection. That's pretty much where you're passing the input to a command to run. Not good, don't do that to start with, but if you filter, you're going to be doing it a lot more safely. So my point here is just really straightforward. It's a small piece of development to prevent a lot of these problems from coming up. And even in the frameworks that you're probably using, you can switch that on. A lot of time there's going to be a function or just a feature for the whole framework saying everything that gets ingested, just filter it. It's going to be a little bit more work, but it's probably going to stop you from having significant problems. So really, really filter. Oh, and blacklist, don't whitelist. So what I'm doing here is I'm whitelisting. So I'm saying here's a list of characters that I accept. I'm not saying don't accept these other characters. Like, for example, the previous slide, I could get around things with a quotation. So a classic response to that is, oh, I'll just block quotations. There's probably a couple of other ways you can insert quotations and other things that are going to break it as well. So you can send, for example, null characters that are encoded in certain ways and break strings and just have unpredictable behavior in your app. So don't blacklist them, don't go try and whack them all with bad stuff. Just say, I'm only going to accept this. You're only on the list, you're not getting it unless you're on the list. That's what we've got there. Okay, let's move. So that's a couple of tech things. I'm going to give you a couple of really easy configuration changes you can make, and I'm going to show you an absolute humdinger of an impact if you don't make this very small configuration change when you're going into production. So this applies to web and mobile, mostly web, but largely like a significant amount of mobile as well if you're using web APIs to access things, because people are not going to, hackers are not going to stop at your mobile application, they're going to have a look at the web APIs that are going on behind it, and verbose there is just as applicable in that case. So the best case, you're going to provide too much information to an attacker. They're going to be able to see what version of .NET you're using, maybe file paths on the system, that sort of thing. Worst case, bang, you can lose it. You can lose a lot of data. Really bad. So here's a stack trace. Has anyone seen one of these before? I imagine if anyone's been on the internet for a while, you've probably seen this. This is kind of a web server throwing its guts up. This is just one I grabbed off Google really quickly. It's not one that I've encountered with any clients. But you can see straight away, I mean, we've got some file paths here that you probably don't want anyone in the sense to know about. Stuff that's going on with SQL. I actually had to truncate that, so there's more things. Yeah, that's kind of a fairly benign example. So here's a less benign example. I didn't put this up lightly. This is an Australian startup. This is a colleague of mine who's doing some work for a client. It was their launch day, so they were pumping the marketing hard. They were all geared up for it, and their web page he logged into and generated this. This is the actual web page, so this is a PHP debug screen. What the application was written in. It gets better. This is the top showing some code. Then you scroll down a little bit and you've got this. So this is accessible to the internet on launch day. We've masked out all the details for obvious reasons, but in this password that you haven't known before. But we could see their database credentials, we could see their Gmail account they're using for their support, and presumably other services as well. So this is just because they didn't turn off a flag when they went to prod. It was probably debug equals false, they needed to switch on. Somebody rolled it out, maybe they were in a hurry, maybe they didn't get the coffee that morning, I don't know. It was a low priority and then it revealed this. So that's pretty significant. You don't want that. And I've seen this before. I've seen not to this level, this is pretty awesome, but I've seen database credentials most commonly revealed in stack traces. Finally, content security policy. I don't know if anybody's familiar with content security policies at all. I see them badly done all the time or not done. Effectively, it's a mitigating measure for your web application. It doesn't really apply so much to mobile. It's effectively telling the browser what to accept. So if you have a serious filtering bug in your application and an attacker can get in there and run whatever they want, but you've got a decent content security policy, you're basically saying, look, I don't want the attacker to be able to pull stuff from their own site. I don't want to be able to post stuff to their own site. I don't want any of that stuff to go on. I only want to talk to things on my site and maybe the Google CDN. There's a lot of options you can set with this. The simplest one is at the top, obviously. Set that header. It's so easy to do, massively easy. Even if you don't have access to the web server, you can set it as a meta tag. The number of cross-site scripting bugs that I've discovered, which I can then run amok with, because I can load scripts off my own personal site. I can post stuff to my own personal site that I'm testing with. And if they just set this one header up, bang, it'll mitigate it. And this is the result of smart people making web browsers trying to protect us from ourselves effectively. What do we got? Finally, we're almost done. In summary here, enforced authentication authorization, that's a really easy way to say something, but there's obviously more complexity to it. This is probably the most complex thing that I've mentioned in this talk. Make sure users are allowed to access what you think they're supposed to access. Don't trust the GUI. Don't trust that they're going to send you the stuff that they're supposed to. Certainly don't expect that they're going to stop at the front-end JavaScript level of your application. They're going to look at the web request. They're going to poke at the UI. At the API. They're going to run it through some tools, and they're going to see what you don't want them to see. So make sure that even with everything known about your system, they have to have authorization to access critical data. Filter everything, just filter everything, always filter. Make sure you don't let any special characters through. As a hacker, special characters are my favorite thing because they let me confuse back-end systems. So if you filter them, you're giving me a bad day straight away. Turn off your debug errors and enable a content security policy, and there's a bit more information about that in that slide. Thanks, guys. Any questions about anything in there?
Any questions?
I should have said at the start, if you have, I always find with talks that I sort of listen to the whole talk and at the end I'm like, I've got to think of a question. I should have said at the start, if you think of anything along the way. If you're interested in any clarification on any of the slides, or want to hear a different story, or ask if I've seen a particular kind of bug, then fire away. Or just...
I suppose the bit we've heard, and especially for startups, is the fact that security costs. It either costs money, it costs time.
Yeah.
And talking about filtering characters, I have the misfortune of working in Europe, and I can't log in. What do you mean? Well, I've got an accent mark on my, good, accent marks, and I mean the Dutch use comma as their decimal point. It's just, yeah.
That was a bug we had, I can talk about it now, those are commas, that was a bug we had at Cemetery. We had people phone up and they'd go, paying their bill, they'd be like, you've charged me 10x. What? Why? There was always one, we couldn't find it, and finally came down to they were using a European laptop.
Yeah.
And it was
So
the
the
keyboard
dot
that
is a
said
comma,
comma,
yeah.
so they put in $600, but it would charge their credit card $6,000. Yeah, it used to happen like once every quarter. We'd like it would drive us nuts. Wow.
One of those things, yeah. So so you're either going to reduce your user experience, or ultimately it's got to be done by the tool level. You can't keep relying on the developer. But that's the thing that I say to people when they do security. It's like security will cost you money. It'll cost you things to get there. That's the nice thing about being a startup. When you do the hack days, the last thing anyone's worried about is security.
Absolutely.
And so you get stuff working. But yeah, we've got a site that happy to running that will go live next week, and yeah, they've got parameterized queries to pull back images. And it's like, well, hang on, but they're images, and their images are stuff they want to sell.
Yep.
And yeah, if you change the number, you get to see another image. So the risk of that is so low compared to the fact that we can get things to work. But then there's also trying to do some other stuff that's firing off an Ajax cross-site scripting. We've had developers now working on it for 2 weeks trying to solve this problem, which we wouldn't have to solve before prior.
It's about your threat model as well. Like,
Yeah.
what are you accessing? Like, if you're not handling any customer data or any medical data, for example, you're going to be able to maybe do things a bit more fast and loose. Maybe. I mean, I agree 100%. Right? Security is expensive. Security is something, but increasingly in the environment, it's got to be something you consider. Which is kind of back to that threat model, that risk matrix.
Yeah.
Like, what's the impact? I mean, can you bear the cost of this particular thing happening? And this is a conversation I have with businesses all the time. Is, do they want to fix this? Do they want to task developers to do this instead of this other feature or whatever? Do we need to actually do anything about this? It's very unlikely. We're going to, or even if it did happen, we wouldn't be too concerned about it. So we're going to, proceed appropriately and maybe.
Speaking of communicating with businesses, how do you communicate with the business to help them understand the value of proactive changes? Because when you've discovered a bug or a vulnerability, you can put it in a threat matrix and communicate in a very specific way what it costs and why you should remedy it, right? But in my experience, many of these things come down to quality and the business trusting a team of engineers to take the time to do things carefully and properly. For example, I found that with the prevalence of SPAs and front ends and back ends being separate, a back end team or engineer has less impetus to consider the full stack than they did 5-10 years ago when they were building the full stack as entirely rendered on the server. And so what that leads to is a back end engineer who isn't bad, but they build an endpoint to return a file or to return some user information, and they haven't necessarily done all of those guards at the top that check. I mean, obviously it's probably going to be authenticated, but to check that it's on the right account, check that they have permissions and on the right account. And so that there's a team culture thing, and it comes back to the team trusting, it comes back to the business trusting the team that they have the time to build something right and completely. And that's proactive because there isn't necessarily a vulnerability at that stage. How do you sell the cost of not being proactive?
So how you sell it is probably a harder question than I can answer, but how we actually deal with it is we have application security process. So we do trust. I guess the word trust is probably a bit of a misnomer here because people are people, they're going to make mistakes, and developers are going to focus on producing something rather than making it secure necessarily. But we have a couple of places I've worked now, an application security function. So people who are security experts, who will actually oversee all of the changes and all the pull requests and actually review them. And I've done that myself. I've actually been viewing all the view requests for a very major application before they can actually go live. And you have a process, you have an organizational process where the approval has to come from the security experts before they can actually.
So you block all the PRs?
No. I mean, I'm part of the process, so part of the workflow. So it has to get approved by someone, and also part of it is security review.
Right.
So
that sounds like it would slow down the development.
Absolutely. Security is a drag. So we're trying to get away from that. The other thing you can do is build it into the developer culture, build it into the knowledge. So you have products like, I'm not spruiking them, I have no affiliation with Secure Code Warrior, for example, but we've used them before. And effectively it's a training program that teaches developers to think a little bit more in terms of security as they're building things. Like the filtering example, right? Like if I was making something, there's no way I'd accept untrusted input. But not a lot of people are not going to think like it. The classic example is when I show them something that they can do, and a person who doesn't understand it says, why would somebody ever do that? I was like, well, they're doing it because they're trying to break it.
And this is more prevalent with startups, right? Because you probably have engineers with are less seasoned, and they're in a startup where it's high pressure, low resources, and they just need to get it functional and out the door.
Yeah, like I kind of think of making software in terms of make it work, make it good, then make it fast, right? So you make it work first and foremost, then you maybe make it a bit more robust, then you maybe optimize it. And where's security in that? But it's hard, it's really hard. I don't have all the solutions for this, but I do know that if you have a high stakes application that isn't secured properly, the risk there is going to come back and bite you if you get hacked. So, I mean, the solution that you could do is do what a lot of people do is say, look, we can't do this, we're going to outsource that knowledge and just get a pen test or an application security review at some stage during the process. So a pen test is a good way to do it. So if you can afford that, you say, look, I'm going to shift this cost to the end of the project, get a company or an individual, someone who knows what they're doing to come in and do it, review my code, look through problems that's likely to occur. I can at least give myself a reasonable level of assurance that I'm not going to have some very low-hanging fruit bugs that's going to cause an issue.
It's what we do every time we every time we put a project forward for a client, and it's a public facing, we'll go and do a pen test. So it should be part of your culture, it's part of your thing. Like we do it at June
There's
end.
pen tests, and then there's pen tests. Like, from having a degree of technical knowledge and listening to you, I can understand that I much prefer your pen test than one from my cyber team at my unnamed employer, because they're gonna use off-the-shelf tools, and I've already spent time I didn't want to spend proving that their passive test produced a false positive that then got me into trouble. But we weren't in trouble, we were fine. You know what I mean? So,
yeah, I mean, and you're right, there's pen testers and there's pen testers. I see that in the industry all the time. Particularly as cyber's so hot now, everyone's getting on board, right? So, you know, people, it's like, you know, like the insulation scandal, right? Like, everyone's getting on installing insulation, but not everyone's qualified to do it. You see that everywhere if there's a carpetbagging type situation. So, I mean,
I think
there
the
is
industry's got a problem as well for the fact that, I mean, with pen tests, you're a startup sitting there and someone says, oh yes, I can do a pen test for you. Yes, I'm right there in Sydney. It's like, well, I'm Perth to start with. I said, you know, pity that it's raining in Sydney. It's like, actually, yes, it is raining in Sydney according to Google and stuff. It's like, oh, so where's the actual, and sure enough, there in Russia or something, you're actually getting the people, and this is the same thing happens to security, getting a security consultant, and then you get broken into the next week.
I wouldn't use anybody. I wouldn't personally use any security tester off Upwork ever. If that's what you're using, I would go stop.
But
I would
that's
go and find
the thing
someone
about
locally.
But then going back to the thing about security and making that part of it, ultimately the startup has it, and this is the nice thing about writing new code with new developers, is you sit there and you say, you know what, we used to write it this way last year, this year we're going to use a complete different stack. And this comes back to the thing, the tool's getting better. The new stack just doesn't have those problems.
Yeah. So there's a lot of protections now that didn't exist before. Sorry.
I'm a co-founder of a tech company. We're dealing with enterprise level clients. Some of them are utilities that are terrorist targets, and so they take their security incredibly seriously. So we recently had a request for latest pen test results with our web application firewalls turned off. So one of the things that I don't understand about that is if we're requested to put a web application firewall in, what is the point in testing it out? That's not a real world test, it's not a true pen test if it's not a real world.
This is a question that I feel quite a bit, particularly when people say, can I drop a firewall or reduce some other kind of control? And my answer to that is simply that we're testing the solution in isolation of other security controls. So the assumption is that control has failed in some way. So it's all part of defense in depth. So we switch that off, and so we can actually see what's going on, fix those problems there, and definitely turn on the web application firewall, for sure. But that should be considered to be a separate control. It probably should have testing by itself. And then if you're doing something that's testing your entire system, sure, do a holistic test on it. That's a great idea as well. But that's more of a red team kind of test where you're testing the whole thing.
Yeah.
Like you're trying to get in by any means necessary, as opposed to just isolating something and nuggeting at that for a while.
So the only other one that I have is my internal theory, and largely my brother works in this space, and he does physical pen tests and social engineering. And I feel that is a far bigger risk than our technical flaws. Like coding, we can work through all of that. Anyone in this room can pay someone to fix anything like that. But you can't fix human fuck.
We're seeing it. So there's one I heard the other day, which is massively increases. It's not even a software hack. Sometimes it is because they'll go in and hack the email server. The one that I've seen that's happening a lot at the moment is they're sending invoices to companies, and if they don't check the bank accounts, they're paying the wrong company.
So they intercept one email and then
Yeah, they
take
send
over
one
the email.
email and they got the email thing, and then they send an invoice. Looks genuine as it is, but all they've done is they've changed the bank things.
So where I'm coming from, my brother's job, they fail companies more on the social engineering side than testing and protecting. But that impacts us just as much as the technical. So what do you do?
It's got to be a security culture change. So you have training programs where, for example, you do phishing attack simulations. Everywhere I've seen fails miserably because of phishing attack simulations. Like, doesn't matter how much you grill the users, 30% of people are still going to click on that link, right? It still looks good. Kind of comes back to that threat model. If you've got someone who's dedicated enough and wants to attack you, they're going to make a convincing looking spearfish for your organisation, doctor up some invoices and things. That's kind of, I almost see that outside the realm of pen testing. It's really hard to defend against. Like, you're going to have, and fraud's been going on since businesses existed.
They did it here locally. There was years ago I heard a story where a local, or one of the big four, was doing some ethical checking around another utility. This one a distribution line, and they threw a load of USB sticks outside the head office, and just to see where they went, and they all ended up like which I think about of the 100 sticks that they threw out in and around the office space. Basically, I think something stupid like 60% ended up in the network. It was something stupid there.
Yeah, there was a conference, and security was part of it. There was this conference, and the guy sitting next to me said, "Oh, yeah, there's these USB sticks out the front, they're free." And I said, "Are you going to put that in your?" He said, "Oh yeah." Turned out it was a keyboard. It plugged in, becomes a keyboard. And yeah, it was all sorts of kids.
Yeah, a good one I've seen was somebody who went to a conference recently and they received a late door prize from the conference, which was actually a really fancy gaming mouse. But the mouse was doctored to have a keyboard emulator built into it. So they got that and went, "Oh, we've received that it works, it's great, this is a whiz-bang mouse, plugged it in and it's..." There's actually a brand of mouse, I have one at home, that you don't even need any special hacks for, because they're designed to be able to take gaming macros. So if you want to play some game, you push by a single button and have 100 keys pressed, which can be a feasible scenario. They can set it up with the software in the mouse, and it will actually run a terminal and download a payload and run it. I've seen this happen. This is off-the-shelf stuff. You can go buy that mouse off eBay today.
So the latest tools have like emulators and like processors in the USB head.
Yep.
Right, but that's more.
Yeah. So the USB, it looks like a key, will actually have
just a cable.
It'll have a full system, or the cable.
Yeah.
And it'll do something like it'll actually have a USB network device built into it. So it can
make a reverse SSH out somewhere.
It can do, but one of the things that there's actually a one you can implement with a Raspberry Pi. You plug it in and just wait 30 seconds, and the light will flash when it's stolen some passwords. And what it actually does is it runs up a fake network, DHCPs to that, and then Windows generally sprays a lot of information about itself around on a local network, and it basically gets that and then stores it, and then you pull it out and you're done. So it's really hard problem. Like, security is hard. We haven't architected things to be secure. We haven't. We're dealing with the fallout of that now. It's so hard.
So on that note, I'm going to go live off-grid somewhere in the southwest. Thank you very much, Scott. How can they get in contact with you if they have any questions?
I killed my old slide. I've got a few cards here if you want. You can hit me at glen@glenscott.net. It's really easy to remember. I also have scottcyber.com.au. So you can hit me glen@scottcyber.com.au. It's kind of easy to remember as well. I could probably...
Cool. We can send it out if you want. We can send out to the community or details.
Yeah. So I've got some cards here, so it's got my contact details. I'll hand them out later if you're interested.
Thank you very much.
So I just want to say, speaking of sending stuff out, we're going to send something out. There is a cybersecurity. Who is that? There's a cybersecurity company called Bankvault, run by a guy called Glen Scott. He's now in Silicon Valley, and he got in touch after seeing that we were putting on a cybersecurity thing, saying, "I want to give you guys something that, as we saw, like passwords kind of suck, right? You've got to type in and it's horrible." So he's doing passwordless authentication. So stay tuned. We're going to send that out to the group, and hopefully he's got a cool offer for stuff. So I just want to put that out there.
Cool.
Thanks, Graham, if you're watching the video.
Okie dokie. We'll be back here in 2 weeks where we will have pitch.
Yes, so don't forget, if you weren't here at the start, we're having a pitch fest day
That's
in 2
pitch
weeks'
with
time.
a P, not a B.
Yes, so
pitch fest,
send us
pitch
an email,
fest.
contact@morningstarter.com, tell us you want to pitch and tell us a bit about your startup and we'll get you in. Cool. 3 minutes, we'll clap you out. So yeah, see you then.
Thank you very much. We've got this space until 9, use it well. Those of you on these chairs, me and Scott are going to try